It's really interesting also to see that like events like this really draw out the true colors of the opponents of Israel, because the whole time they've been saying how, there's this distinction to be made between people who full on support Hamas and want Israel destroyed. You have those people out there, but then you have people who are like trying to be fine-tuned critical, like they shouldn't be doing indiscriminate bombing. There's too much collateral damage. Yeah, maybe Israel has the right to, but not like this. And then this happens exactly in the way some of those people say it should, and they're just like, and you see people like Sean King and
famous white man Sean King.
Oh my God! Yeah, I saw what you wrote there. Like, what was the tweet you just said? Somebody wrote about it. You saw his
white people are the worst.
White people are the worst. You know who Sean King is?
I actually don't.
Look him up. You'll see what he's talking about. But he basically saying like it brings out the true colors of sympathy and solidarity for Hamas, in that what Israel is actually facing and what the supporters of Israel and the Jewish community and the Zionist community is facing is not just a disagreement on policy or critiques of Israeli military or government policy. We're facing support for we're facing people who support monsters, and they come out in droves now, either in their support and solidarity with the Hamas or their deafening silence in the events like this. Like you mentioned, these politicians or whatever who say nothing,
Yeah, I think it's always just stunning the way nothing is ever good enough, right? Like, going in with airstrikes isn't good enough. Going in with actual human beings putting Israeli lives at risk isn't good enough. Precision strikes that take out nothing but the bad guys aren't good enough. It's almost like they don't want Jews defending themselves. I think that's the ultimate conclusion here, is that nothing Jews will ever be good enough. It's really like the center of the double standard, which is how I approach everything to do with anti-Semitism, is there is no answer that is good enough because they don't want an answer. They miss the days where Jews would just sit there and get rounded up into camps and gassed with no ability to defend themselves. And now that there are not only Israeli Jews, but American Jews who have the ability to defend themselves, they really don't like it because a fair fight, it's not quite the same.
Yeah. What do you think motivates that at the various levels, where the problem is just that Jews are still here and we still exist at its core? Like, it's lip service to say you can defend yourself, but not like this, not like this, not like this, right? If it's an airstrike with collateral damage, that's wrong. If it's precision, then you were aggressive on sovereign territory and invaded other people's, and then you're like responsible for the retaliatory attacks of your enemies because you were the ones who escalated. So it's a lose-lose. But
do you really feel like people want to see Jews gassed?
I think some people do, for sure.
Yeah,
I think I'm very careful with how I talk about anti-Semitism, because I always think there's at least two different camps, right? And I think there are people out there who genuinely want all Jews to be killed. I think we're seeing some of them on American streets today, marching around, quite openly calling for Jews to be killed, that Hitler was right, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those people are also, ironically, the people who say that the Holocaust is made up. The Holocaust was great, but also totally made up. Right. I also think there's a lot of just ignorant people who are really the useful idiots. And we've seen that throughout history. People who don't really openly or knowingly hate Jews, but just go along with it because they've fallen into whatever the trap of the latest anti-Semitism is. So if you look at contemporary anti-Semitism, which is anti-Israel anti-Semitism, it's really nothing to do with Israel, right? It's all to do with hating Jews just through a different lens, which happens to be Israel this time. And so a lot of people just go along with it thinking, Israel is a rich Western country. Palestinians are not. Israelis are white. Palestinians are brown. They're looking at it through different lens and just skipping the thought process, skipping the history, skipping the context. And then, of course, it doesn't help when you have supposedly intellectual people like John Oliver coming out and comparing what's going on in the West Bank to the Holocaust. But because he's British and he makes funny faces and occasionally says the F word in a silly accent, he must be right. And, being British and therefore correct is my thing.
You're immune to that. We're under his spell still.
We have the Jon Stewart, who's our Jew, who's like, yeah. Well, I find that the real clear distinction between the left-wing anti-Semitism and the right-wing, which I want to talk about, is like specifically on the right, is the implicit and the explicit, because the left wing has this core value of anti-racism. So they can't explicitly be anti-Semitic. It has to be couched in a sort of anti-colonialist narrative. But on the far right, which has been this weird ascendant thing, especially in the response to wokeness and the reactionary right that we're seeing, where, under the crusade of anti-cancel culture and free speech, we're going to say the most provocative, abhorrent things we can say, which is about Jews, because those are the group, that's the group now that's front and center, and we're going to make Israel the persona non grata enemy number one, public enemy number one. But I'm seeing it on the far right where where you're finding this explicit anti-Semitism. What's your take on that and how representative it is? Because at one point during the Trump era, first term, a lot of people on the left were very happy to condemn anti-Semitism when it comes from the white supremacist ilk. And I always thought, that's marginal. Charlottesville, those aren't good people, obviously. Mm-hmm. They're not fine people on both sides. But those people are pretty marginal. They're not representative in the culture. But sadly, post-October 7th, I've been seeing, and I've been avoiding naming names for a while, but after an event like last night, Jackson Hinkle getting out there on Twitter, mm-hmm. expressing solidarity with Hamas and rest in peace Khania and the American Communist Party, but America first, and Jake Shields and these folks who are and Nick Fuentes types, they're gaining this popularity of this edgy new frontier that is really, really disturbing to me as a Jew. And I'm curious what your take on that is of the far right ascendance.
Yeah, it's kind of a lot to unpack there. I think one is it's nothing new. It's just it appears new, right? I think social media provides us with a window into things that were already there. They were just happening in the shadows and didn't get quite the same momentum that they do today. There's a lot of monetization aspects to this, where if you've got something really this is a problem on X and Twitter, mm-hmm. I'm ruthlessly free speech, right? I think all these people, including Nick Fuentes, who I think is a piece of shit, have a right to be on social media and a right to share all their horrible ideas, as long as they're legal and that they don't actively incite violence, things like that. But the thing is, there is a downside to that, which is, especially when it's monetized, you have people who are incentivized to share the kind of content that gets attention. And you see this from a lot of people who I don't actually think actively hate Jews. They're just jumping on this bandwagon of this stuff is pretty popular. It's almost like I'm not allowed to say it culturally, so I'll go ahead and say it. Therefore, it's correct. And there's a lot of illogical steps you've just completely leapt over. And so I think you're right in that, obviously, far-right anti-Semitism is a problem. It's been a problem for decades, if not longer, but it's part of a broad spectrum of anti-Semitism that people don't want to address. This has been my criticism of Republicans, Democrats, everyone left, right, center, is that people only care about anti-Semitism in a broad sense when it is a way for them to actually attack the other side. So, for example, in 2018 is the first time I became openly politically active is after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. Obviously, that was a white supremacist shooting. And so you had the entire left coming out in droves condemning anti-Semitism. But what they were doing is they were condemning far-right anti-Semitism, because you have black anti-Semitism, they don't care. You have Muslim anti-Semitism, they don't care. You have far-left, communist, Marxist, whatever you want to call it, anti-Semitism, they don't care. They have general academic anti-Israel anti-Semitism, they do not care. But the same is true of the right, is that everyone is all over Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. Ilhan Omar can't go outside and eat a bagel without someone talking about how it's somehow anti-Semitic. But then
cultural
you have
appropriation if she did that. Cultural appropriation if she ate a bagel.
It turns to ash in her mouth.
Yeah.
But anyone on quote unquote our side does the same thing.
Some people did something with cream cheese. Yeah. Oh my God.
That's real hypnosis right there.
Yeah. Oh my
God. But
it's
people on our side, quote unquote our side, or anyone who's close to our side.
Yeah.
They do something that Ilhan Omar would do, and it's crickets, or it's dismissing it, or it's somehow defending it. I'm not just talking about Kanye West, who's the obvious example. I'm talking about someone like Tucker Carlson, for example, who dismisses what's going on in Israel's, it's just a foreign conflict, why should we care? And then he's jet setting off to every country you can possibly name. You've got Joe Rogan, who I think is wonderful. Joe Rogan has done a lot for the free speech movement, for the libertarian movement. His show is obviously great for just conversations, but saying things like, Jews love money like Italians love pizza. One, not particularly funny. I think there are far better Jewish jokes out there. But two, if Ilhan Omar said something like that, or any left-wing so-called comedian said that, conservatives will be all over it. And so I think that's the problem with me. It's the selective snowflakeness of both sides when it comes to the issue, and they don't actually care about anti-Semitism itself. They care about using that as a weapon against their enemy. And if it's your side, they don't really care.
So to clarify on the Joe Rogan example, because I remember people, you're saying you're not criticizing Joe Rogan in that instance. You're saying the people who react to that are not doing it for genuine purposes of combating anti-Semitism, because whether they care if it comes, they're using it as a weapon to just go after a Joe Rogan or go after those who follow him and to say, you see, this, your figurehead must be smeared and invalidated because of some silly joke.
Yeah, I think two things, right? One, I think what Joe Rogan said, he has every right to say. I don't think it's correct. There are plenty of poor Jews who are not into money. It's also hilarious. He got paid hundreds of $1 millions to a podcast. He clearly loves money and he's not Jewish. How does that possibly work? But he was also speaking in the context of talking about Israel and talking about anti-Semitism. He was talking with someone who was actively, in the moment, defending Ilhan Omar for anti-Semitism. So that matters, right? It wasn't like you and I just talking about bagels and one of us makes a Jewish joke. They were actually talking about anti-Semitism. So that matters. I don't think he should be counseled. I don't think that means he's anti-Semitic. It was a throwaway comment. It was a joke, right?
Right.
But then my issue comes is I want people to be consistent. If you're actually anti-Semitism, that has to include when it's people who are on your side, or you really want to go on Joe Rogan's show. Because a lot of people, like, I would love to go on Joe Rogan's show. I probably never will. It doesn't matter too much to me. But I'm going to
after this episode, Ian.
Who knows?
It's a stepping stone.
Who knows?
Tell
Who knows?
Renan's joke. Renan's joke about Rogan.
Yeah, we had a comedian friend of mine named Renan Hirschberg who said, like, he makes this joke where he's like, I just think like Joe Rogan is bad for society. He's just bad for society. I just think he is. The only way I would ever go on his show is if he asked me. If him or anyone from his team responded to my many emails, I would go on. Well, I think the fundamental difference there is that the sense of it's not the comments that people make, it's who's making the comments. And there's a subjectivity to it. Because if we trust that Joe Rogan, who has a history of being open and inclusive of everybody, has all different kinds of voices on his show and is just a genuinely curious person. So he has somebody on who, like an Abby Martin, but then he also has Coleman Hughes, and he sort of reflects the curious ignorance of a situation to be open to ideas, meaning there's not much of an agenda there, which I think is why he's so successful. And he's a comedian, then like there is a truth that he's making, and I don't think he's thinking as much about the sensitivity of the context of somebody who's talking about Ilhan Omar. He's just saying, yeah, like I know that to be true because in comedic circles we make those stereotypical jokes all the time. So he's sort of relaying that sentiment. If Ilhan Omar is making comments about Jews and money, it does not come from a good place. It comes from a more malicious place with malicious intention. So I think for a lot of people, you know, it's sort of like when your best friend calls you something versus when an enemy calls you something.
Yes.
It's the same statement, but it means very different things depending on who it comes from because of the trust factor. And we do not trust a Rashida and an Ilhad when they talk about Israel and Jews because I think their motivations are questionable at best, right?
And I think the context of that conversation is why I brought it up, right? I don't really care that Joe Rogan makes jokes about anyone because I don't care about really what any comedian says about Jews. Like their purpose is to make people laugh. I don't really care how you do that. If you care about free speech, you can't be overly sensitive and laugh at fat jokes, but then not laugh at Jewish jokes, right? I think the problem that for me is that it came in the context of someone defending Ilhan Omar's comments about Jewish gold and AIPAC being motivated by money. And the response to that was, well, yeah, Jews love money, obviously. Like that's the issue, is because if you're a comedian and you're making jokes, fine, I do not care. But there's a strange thing going on more on the right and the left of comedians hopping between comedy and political commentary. I don't think Joe Rogan is necessarily doing this, but we're seeing it on a broader level where you kind of get away with both, right? I can say something false, I'm just joking. Then I can say something that's not funny, I'm a commentator. And I think that's the issue for me, is like, how do we judge those people, right? Because if your only purpose is to make me laugh, great, make me laugh. But if suddenly you're someone like Stephen Colbert, who's for some reason dancing with Chuck Schumer, and then the second he's not funny, it's like, oh yeah, but I'm making a broader point. It's like, no, your broader purpose is to make me laugh. That's it. Otherwise, shut up.
That's a topic that endlessly frustrates me. And, you know, it's not even just the Jon Stewarts and John Olivers and the late night hosts now. Even podcasters who have no expertise in anything, you know, they'll talk very, very seriously and very in depth about topics they have no idea about. And then when they get called out, they're, well, I'm just a podcaster.
Just asking questions.
Yeah. I think since October 7th, the stock of podcasters commenting on world events has gone way down for me. Like, I mean, to me, it was really illuminating how much some of these people I really relied on for my commentary really know nothing about anything, and they never have.
Yeah. It's very eye-opening when you listen to a lot of these people. There's one is, if you're entertaining, that's often seen as a proxy for knowledge or understanding. Kind of the same what I said about John Oliver. He's British, therefore people think he's smart. It's like, trust me, there are some really dumb British people out there.
Right.
But just make a funny face, you get away with anything. But it's like, just because someone's entertaining or funny doesn't make them correct. And that's the big thing, is that we just see these, it's kind of the morphing of political space and the celebrity space, is we just assume someone's famous, assume someone has a platform, and we just assume good faith, which I think we should do. But if someone is showing you over and over again that they're acting in bad faith, and you keep allowing them to hide behind the good faith nonsense, and that's when the consumer needs to be waking up and actually thinking, do I put trust in this person? Or do I at least still engage with their content, but through a lens that actually understands they may be talking out of their ass on this topic or many topics?
Yeah. So how do you draw the distinction between commentators and journalists? I mean, you spoke about this you were on the Rubin Report, reflecting on conversations that I had when I spoke to Candace about Israel, and it sort of revealed that there's a problem that goes on both sides of the aisle in the commentator class, where we now have, you have podcasters who are just talking about anything, but people who specifically in the political or cultural space having takes on things. There's such a wide array of authority that people have on particular issues, but you have to talk every day and give your take. So what, in your mind, is the difference between the commentator and the journalist, and what responsibilities relatively do they have to their audience?
Well, I think the journalist is a very rapidly shrinking category of people. Whereas now journalism means you have a Twitter account and you simply repost what's going viral on Twitter. That is not journalism. That is not a journalist. I think there are a handful of journalists still out there who are motivated by just uncovering the truth, right? They're not motivated by a narrative. They're not motivated by their own bias. It's just, this is happening. I'm going to go find out the truth. That's what journalism should be. And now it's become anyone with thumbs and a phone is a journalist. Like, people call me a journalist all the time, and I take them up and I am not a journalist. I sit there and I tell you what I think about something that's going on. I also try and do what too few people do, is admit when I don't know something, and I'll go away and look it up. This happens when I go to college campuses. Hopefully not too often, but if someone asks me a question and I simply don't know enough about the question, I will tell them I don't know. But that's something that you do not see in the commentary class, is that not knowing is a sign of weakness, and you have to have an opinion, and you have to have an opinion now. And that's the big problem, is you see people jumping on every single issue. Journalism has to be now. That's another problem. But if you're a commentator, you're pretending to be a journalist. You're taking someone else's so-called facts and you're just spewing it out as your own, and usually plugging the gaps of ignorance with paper while you're doing it. I think commentators and journalists couldn't be more different. It's like the difference between an author and someone reading a book, right? There is no overlap except for perhaps the language they're sharing. You are not the same. And I think any commentator calling themselves a journalist because they've hastily Wikipedia'd something the night before they talk about it is not the same thing. Like, I'm not a journalist. I will never claim to be a journalist. Kind of in the same way, right? Like, sometimes some of the content I put out there hopefully makes people laugh, right? I'm not a comedian. A comedian is I think one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult types of art form there is. Just because you're occasionally funny doesn't make you a comedian. And I'm not just kissing your ass right now. Yeah, no. I honestly believe it. Yeah. But it's when people say, oh, I'm a comedian, when they make slightly funny jokes every now and again to try and hide behind the fact that they're wrong, for example. I think these categories mean something. Journalist means something. I think we need to get back to respecting true journalism, but also holding then journalists to account for not being activists, for telling the truth, and for actually going after the stories that matter.
Is the problem, though, that less that the commentator is calling themselves a journalist, but rather the general population is consuming commentary as journalism? And in that sense, the responsibility is different. Like, I'm editorializing, I'm giving my takes, and people consume that as fact or as journalism. But I wonder if the standards need to just be more laid out and clear, especially because under the guise of it's less that commentators are calling themselves journalists, but more that journalists who are calling themselves journalists are really just narrative-driven people in the space,
Yeah, and I think a lot of this also comes down to consumers are responsible for a lot of the stuff they are consuming, right? A lot of us like to look at the system we live in and blame various things. Like, we don't like to blame the fact that social media has problems. We like to blame the fact that TV has problems, the kind of things that are popular. We like to blame things like TikTok. But the reality is, it's because people are willing to consume that. And I think as a society, we don't hold ourselves accountable for the stuff we consume, and yet we blame the people who are pumping out the stuff we're actively shoving down our throats. And you can't have both, right? There has to be some responsibility there.
It's a little bit, I'm pessimistic about that, though, because it is a little bit hard these days to even make a choice about what you're consuming. I mean, like, you're going against the TikTok algorithm. It's hardly a choice to stop.
Well, don't use TikTok, right? One of my things is I'm actually not on TikTok. It's hard because you have to make sacrifices to some extent, right? And I understand why people are on TikTok, but again, depends on what kind of person you are, right? I'm a commentator who is pushing what I believe to be American conservative values. I care about the West. I care about not embracing the CCP and everything they're doing, and not handing them all of my data. I think it would be drastically hypocritical of me to then use TikTok for my own personal enrichment. And I see a lot of conservative commentators out there who will rail on and on about how awful China is, but then will go and use TikTok. And it's like, yes, I understand in the short term, you're reaching people, but a lot of this, I think, is actually about personal enrichment. And the fact is, you can make a lot of money on TikTok, and you have to be willing, in the same way, for example, as calling out people, knowing you might not go on their show. Right, like I call out people on all sides of the political spectrum, because this isn't about necessarily getting on a show for me. But look at someone like Tucker Carlson, say things that are pretty openly dodgy about Israel and therefore Jews, or he has someone like John Rich, for example, come on and bring up the Rothschilds randomly about a Bible he's talking about. We know why he's bringing up the Rothschilds. Like, come on, no one's that subtle. And I'm one of the few people who are calling it out, knowing I won't get invited on Tucker Carlson's show anymore. But I look around and I see a lot of conservatives who are just willing to look the other way because it's about their own enrichment or their own fame. And I think that's the problem, is that if you're selling ideas, if you're selling a movement, and you're selling yourself as one of the many faces of that movement, you have to live by those rules. You simply can't pick and choose the rules you want. And yes, it's a problem that again, how do you fix that? And I think you do it on a personal level.
Can I give both of you guys a compliment?
No.
I think something that I'm pretty new to like all this conservative media space, but something Ami's opened my eyes to is like the commentators with an ideology and principles and values seem to have more longevity than the ones who don't have that. I think you guys are both driven by sort of a vision you have and like real principles, which guides the choices you make.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's nice to see.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
That's all. That's all.
This is where I immediately plug all my merch, right?
Hold up the mugs, Ian. Well, I guess that's interesting because where do we draw the line then between areas of disagreement and that sort of spectrum of people who are still engageable, even if they've said objectionable things? You know, if we believe in this sort of culture that's a wider umbrella of conversation, like obviously post October 7th, things were, for on a personal level, to see Tucker Carlson take the stance he took in this sort of vague, like speaking out of both sides of his mouth, like, you know, I really care about Israel. It's a great country, but I don't really care about it.
Yeah.
Like, what is happening? You know, and the laugh was very disturbing. But just to be like, I'm not, if you care about Israel, you're not really an American. And I have children here, and my children are American. And for Ben Shapiro to care about Israel, he's clearly not really an American. Like, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But with time, like, so that was like really outrageous. But with time, you begin to, like, you're attributing a lot of it to people being opportunistic. But at the same time, you know, I remember Patrick Bet-David says the Israeli wire. Clearly, we call it the Israeli wire. And like trying to wedge this issue of the Christian conservative from the Jewish conservative. And it all felt really like gross. But at the same time, if we're attributing, what do we attribute that to? Is it purely them also being opportunistic? In which case, if they're not actually being anti-Semitic in what they're doing, then it's even worse in a sense because they're just using it as an opportunity to siphon off audience. Is it purely a business decision? But then overall, at the same time, like the totality of what these people do, does it disqualify them from the realm of conversation in which maybe you said something pretty disturbing about Israel, like focusing on the Christians oppressed in the West Bank as opposed to all the Christians who've been persecuted in the region, but you choose Israel? Like, what motivates that? Is it best to engage with that to figure out what's motivating that and maybe get past it or reach some sort of better understanding, or take a more hardline approach of like, no, I'm writing you off and I don't care, I'm going to call you out? Like, what's your position on that?
I think to some extent you can do both, where I'm, for example, to focus on Tucker Carlson again, like he's done a lot of good things for our movement, right? I think he's right on a lot of things. He's obviously changed his mind on a lot of things, and people change their mind for good reasons and bad reasons. The way I usually judge that is how financially beneficial was that change of mind, right? I respect the people, for example, who come out with an opinion that doesn't benefit them immediately financially. It's like all of these influencers who are rampant communists, and then they suddenly made a lot of money as open conservatives. It's like, okay, well, then it becomes hard. Some of them might be genuine. Some of them might have just fallen into a new career that happened to make them a lot of money getting famous, which is what they wanted to do as leftists. But then there are some people who are just completely opportunistic. And it's very hard to judge between those two people just based on what they say, right? Because they might be saying the right thing, but for the wrong reasons. And I don't want to be like a purist either. So I think quite often it's a case of just watching someone over time and actually seeing, do they change their mind based on who they speak with? Because people are allowed to be wrong, right? You're allowed to be ignorant. You're allowed to say the wrong thing and not have your career destroyed. I think that's a hallmark of the left that I'm obviously opposed to. I'm not in favor of cancel culture. But in the same way, you also, if you're going to be a face of a movement, it's like people who are trying to expand the conservative tent beyond what conservatism means. If it's just all about having people on board, why don't we just endorse basically socialism for everyone, and we'll have all the socialists voting for us, and then we might win every election. Now, if you have a movement that is based on values, then at some point you have to just judge people based on the values you're pushing. Then you have to have a conversation, either is my movement changing? Am I okay with that? Do I push for the movement to change? Or do I try and change these people's minds? And I think like someone like Tucker Carlson, he's obviously open to a lot of conversations. And so I would like to think that he's perhaps open to these views. He might just be coming at something from a completely different perspective of the America First route of I simply don't care about what happens outside of American borders, which is just historically wrong. That's blown up in people's faces quite literally time after time. But at least that's like an honest position that you can actually get to the heart of. And the only way rather you actually get to the root of that is by having conversations with people. There's no other way of finding out what is in someone's heart.
I guess it's there's areas within any particular movement, political movement, libertarian or conservative, where honest conservatives and honest libertarians can disagree. I guess the question is, when is it honest, right? So assessing that honesty is the tricky part, and what's motivating somebody. Is it in good faith? Because I hear what you're saying, and we also want to be careful not to use anti-Semitism as an accusation on everything that we find objectionable. Like Tucker Carlson may be wrong, and Patrick Bet-David, I thought his take on it was inartful. Let's be gracious there, and what he was talking when he was covering the Daily Wire and the falling out. But like, I'm also not going to be quick to throw out terms like anti-Semitism, lest
it's very important.
lose its cultural power completely, which is what the left did, and left of center Jewish community did for many, many years leading up to this.
And that's also, I'm sorry just to jump in real quick, but that's also what you see as one of the go-to defense if you are ever accused of being anti-Semitic. Because of course you say that. Like, I'm sure you get this all the time on social media. You're Jewish. Like, that's the immediate comeback. It's like, well, the problem there is that mostly secular Jews, but to some extent, some conservative Jews have used the backlash response of anti-Semitism as the shield. And so you're going to have this back and forth of both sides are wrong, overusing both that as a defense and an attack. And so I think you're completely right that we need to actually be careful, as you can be opening the door to anti-Semitism without being anti-Semitic. You can be saying anti-Jewish things without being anti-Semitic, because a lot of that is also about intent. And that's, I think, the most important thing that we miss so much in any debate is, what is your intent? What are your true views? Are you wrong, or are you knowingly pushing something that is wrong? Huge difference.